It's great to be joined today by James Fallows, who's a national correspondent for The Atlantic and co-author with his wife Deborah Fallows of Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. It's so great to talk to you, James, and the book is fascinating. You went all over the country, 25 cities, I believe, flying to most or all of them in a single-engine plane, which you piloted. Talk to us a little bit about the sort of objective of the project.
The objective was essentially just to see the US. And there was a particular predicate for it, which is that from 2006, really until 2011, Deb and I were living in China and reporting for The Atlantic. And Deb was writing a book called Dreaming in Chinese. And what we had tried to do there, even while being based both in the first Shanghai for a couple of years and then Beijing, was essentially to spend all of our time on the road and going to every little province and on ox carts, literally, and trains and buses and riverboats. So we thought we came back to the U.S. and back to our home in D.C. It'd be worth trying to do some of the same reporting in the U.S. And we had for a long time flown around this little propeller plane, a Cirrus SR-22 with a parachute for the whole plane. And we knew there were lots of places you could get to that way. You couldn't get to very easily by interstates or by commercial airlines. So we just thought, let's see what kind of there is there. If we want to spend time in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or in Duluth, Minnesota, or in Columbus, Mississippi. And so this ended up going on for more than 4 years. And we sort of, each step we took, we learned new things.
I think that it's quite common that there are people in the US who, assuming that you're sort of in the income bracket where you can afford to do some travel, who will often end up becoming more familiar with other parts of the world than the parts of their own country that maybe aren't as accessible to them. I know that only in recent years have I started to go to places like I was in rural northern Indiana a few months ago. I've been to Ohio. I've been to some other places that wouldn't sort of be natural vacation spots. Did you find that, or do you find that this is a pretty common phenomena, that many traveling Americans know foreign countries better than they know the different corners of the US?
I think that's a great point. And so a homely example of that will be that over the last 40 years now, my wife and I have lived essentially half of our time in DC. And it's always true that people who are visiting DC go out and see museums and restaurants and new attractions that if you're living in the place, you don't get around to seeing. And I'm sure that's true of any big town. I think it's also the case that again, Americans who are in the traveling class, when you're in the U.S., it's remarkable that the, say, dozen hub airports, Denver, Atlanta, O'Hare, San Francisco, Seattle, et cetera, get something like 80% of all the commercial traffic, because that's how things are concentrated in various ways. And people, their air travel takes them to places that look familiar. And when you think of exploring the world, it might be places from Tuscany to, if you're adventuresome, Singapore or Southeast Asia or Australia or maybe Africa, more than South Dakota, more than Missouri, more than Mississippi. And so that was part of our wanting to remedy that imbalance too.
One of the things I was struck by about 6, 8 months ago when I went to rural northern Indiana, this was sort of my first trip to a really red area after the election of Donald Trump, other than maybe some parts of the Florida panhandle, was that even though I had kind of like an on paper understanding of how and why it is that people in some of these parts of the country voted so overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, I still was passing a certain degree of judgment on it. And after spending some time living in northern, or not living, but visiting northern rural Indiana, I realized that, of course, they voted for Donald Trump once I understood that in a lot of these places, the only meeting point is the mega evangelical church, as an example. Of course, that's how they ended up voting. And it really shifted my perspective about just how different the day-to-day lives are of people in different parts of the country. Do you have any anecdotes that resonates with?
Yes, and our complementary, with an E rather than I view to that is a different kind of both explanation and puzzle for the results in the 2016 election. Most of the places we ended up spending time were in states that went for Donald Trump. With the Plain states, and we were in both Allentown and Erie, Pennsylvania, and the South, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and it was on the one hand, you would think these places would not be expressing outrage of the kind that was normally diagnosed after the election, in that most places the economy was slowly improving. Most places, believe it or not, were being quite inclusive of immigrants. For example, in western Kansas, the population is now mainly Latino. In Betsy DeVos's hometown of Holland, Michigan, that also is majority Latino now. There's lots of other indications I could give you of something resembling a healthy American civic fabric. And yet, when it comes to talking about national politics, there was this really polarized, extreme, bitter, resentment-driven feeling, which was embodied, among other places, in some of these mega churches. So you could have in Dodge City a place that went very heavily for Donald Trump, but their city finance manager, who's very popular there, is a man named Ernesto de la Rosa, who's there on a DACA waiver. And their school district is majority Latino, and they're voting bond issues to keep it going. So something in this disconnect between the increasingly tribal and resentment-driven national politics, which made people think, yes, Trump is against our enemies, and we really hate Hillary Clinton because she's crooked. They would vote that way nationally, and the texture of local life was different from that.
Can you talk a little bit about, are there examples that you might have for, our audience is mostly a progressive audience, although they're not just in cities on the coast, they're really spread out throughout the United States. But we've heard this theme that if you don't understand rural America, you don't understand why Trump won. What are some of the specifics that maybe aren't understood about rural America?
So I think there's one, so I should say as background that both my wife and I, although I worked for the Atlantic forever and we're part of, quote, the national media, unquote, we are from originally small inland towns and felt as if this was our territory. I'm from a little place called Redlands in California, excuse me, which is right next to San Bernardino. It's very different from coastal California. Deb is from a manufacturing town in Ohio, Vermilion, Ohio, which is west of Cleveland. So we felt as if these were places familiar from our upbringing, though not our current life. One, I think, understandable point of resentment is less the familiar one of economic dislocation, which of course is real, or the opioids disaster, which is of course a disaster and becoming a nationwide one. It's what I think of as two-dimensionality versus three-dimensionality, which is when there are media or movie or print magazine or newspaper discussions of Boston or of DC or of San Francisco or of other big centers, the tone tends to be a sort of richly three-dimensional portrayal of people's motives and the complexities there and people's agency and the ways they're trying to respond to their environments. I think there is an awareness by most of the interior of America of being presented two-dimensionally, that media people will go there and go to a diner and find somebody with a Trump hat and say, are you still angry? Do you still like Trump? And just presenting people as victims and objects, and as being significant mainly as sort of background players in the national political drama. And I think that most people in any part of the U.S., any part of the world where I've lived, they like to think of themselves as the central characters in their own lives. And they have their own independent drama, and they're making things better and worse, and they have agency and they have choice and all the rest. So I think that is one. I'll give you one illustration of that. There's a piece in a leading website that I won't name right now that was tracing this Russian spy who was recently arrested, the young woman Russian spy. When she went out to South Dakota, the Russian spy was sort of allying with the NRA there. And the piece was framed as here we are in a lightly populated state, most familiar as the home of Mount Rushmore. This was talking about the city of Sioux Falls, which actually we spent a long time in. It's a very leading tech city, Sioux Falls. They have lots of precision agriculture that comes from there. And so I think the people in Sioux Falls will think, what the hell? We're being portrayed as kind of these bit players in a national media caricature of what life is like away from Brooklyn or DC. So I think that the be, an awareness of being presented as one-dimensional or two-dimensional figures rather than fully fleshed out figures is an underappreciated point.
I'm curious as far as your method of transportation, your single engine propeller plane with a parachute. Were there any at any point during this trip situations with the plane that did not go as planned, close calls, emergencies, or was that not a dramatic part of the trip in any way?
We tried to minimize the drama. This was
Right.
the extension to the flying world of the no drama Obama policy. We wanted to, I have an instrument rating. I've done this for a long time, but we wanted to fly in good weather. But there's always something unexpected in small planes. So we ended up spending an unexpected day in Murray, Kentucky, home of Murray State University, when some spark plug suddenly failed. We were over the desert of Arizona when suddenly all navigation info just was blotted out in the plane. The GPS system just went entirely down.
Hmm.
We were minorly reassured when we heard on the air traffic control, Albuquerque Center, this is United 404. We've lost all our guidance. It was the Air Force was testing an entire jamming of the GPS system for time use. They hadn't let us know about this in advance, but
Perfect.
so we had surprises, but no emergencies.
Well, the book is fascinating. It's called Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. The book has two authors, James Fallows, who's been speaking with us, as well as his wife, Deborah Fallows, and I encourage you to check out the book. And James, I really appreciate you talking to me today.
David, I'm very grateful to your interest and that of your audience. So thank you.